Sophie stood by his grave, clutching the letter he had written her, the one he had given to her on their last night together. She hadn't been able to read it until now. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper, her tears staining the ink as she read his words, the silent goodbye. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain as Sophie stood at the edge of the pier. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sky blended into the ocean in a haze of grey and blue. She clutched a letter in her hand, its edges frayed from being read and reread countless times. This was where it all began, this very pier. The memories flooded back, each one sharper than the last, and she could feel the weight of them pressing against her chest. It had been 2 years since she last saw him, and yet he was as real to her now as he had been then. Alex had come into her life like a storm, unexpected, intense, and impossible to ignore. They met one summer evening when she had gone to the beach to clear her head. He had been sitting by the water, his guitar resting on his knee, playing a melody that felt like it was meant just for her. Sophie had been drawn to the music, and before she realized it, she was standing next to him, listening in silence. He looked up at her with the warmest smile she had ever seen, and in that moment, something shifted inside her. They talked for hours that night, sharing stories of their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Alex was unlike anyone Sophie had ever met. He had a way of seeing the world that was both hopeful and heartbreaking, as if he knew how fragile happiness could be, but chose to chase it anyway. Sophie, who had always been cautious, found herself wanting to be brave with him. She wanted to take risks, to dive into the unknown, just to see where it might lead. As the summer days passed, their connection deepened. They spent their nights on the beach, under the stars, talking about everything and nothing. Alex would play his guitar, and Sophie would close her eyes, letting the music carry her away. It was in those quiet moments that she realized she was falling in love with him. It wasn't just the way he made her laugh, or the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. It was the way he made her feel like she was finally home. But Alex had secrets. There were times when he would pull away, his smile fading, his eyes darkening with something Sophie couldn't quite understand. She would ask him what was wrong, and he would shake his head, telling her not to worry. But she did. She could feel the distance growing between them, even as they lay side by side, their fingers intertwined. She wanted to help him, to be there for him, but she didn't know how. One night, as they sat together on the pier, Alex finally told her the truth. He had been sick for a long time, longer than he had let on. It wasn't something that could be fixed, no matter how much they wanted it to be. Sophie's heart shattered as he spoke, each word breaking her a little more. He had known from the beginning that their time together would be short, but he hadn't wanted to tell her. He hadn't wanted to hurt her. Sophie couldn't breathe. The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to think. She had known that something was wrong, but she had never imagined this. The future she had started to picture, of them together, of all the things they would do, the places they would go, was slipping away from her, vanishing like smoke in the wind. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, asked him why. Why hadn't he told her? Why had he let her fall in love with him, knowing that it would end like this? Alex took her hand, his touch gentle, as if he was afraid he might break her. "Because I couldn't help it," he said softly. "I didn't want to love you, but I did. I do. and I don't regret a single moment of it." His words cut through her like a knife, and she hated him for it, hated him for making her love him when he knew there was no future for them. But she also loved him more in that moment than she ever had before. The days that followed were both beautiful and unbearable. They spent every moment together, knowing that time was slipping away from them. Sophie tried to be strong, tried to hold it together for his sake, but there were nights when she cried herself to sleep, the pain of losing him already too much to bear. Alex, always the optimist, would hold her close, whispering that everything would be okay, even though they both knew it wouldn't be. As the end drew near, Alex became weaker. His laughter grew quieter, his once strong hands trembling when he tried to play his guitar. But even in his frailty, he was still the same Alex, the man who had stolen her heart with a smile and a song. Sophie stayed by his side, refusing to leave him, even when it became clear that there was nothing more she could do. She couldn't save him, but she could be there for him. She could love him. On the last night they spent together, Alex asked Sophie to promise him something. He didn't want her to stop living after he was gone. He wanted her to chase her dreams, to find happiness again. Even if it wasn't with him. Sophie nodded, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. How could she live in a world without him? How could she move on when her heart would always belong to him? The morning after Alex passed, the world felt emptier, colder. Sophie stood by his grave, clutching the letter he had written her, the one he had given to her on their last night together. She hadn't been able to read it until now. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper, her tears staining the ink as she read his word. He told her that he loved her, that he always would, and that even though he was gone, he would never truly leave her. He would always be with her, in every song, in every sunset, in every moment of her life. In the weeks and months that followed, Sophie tried to find her way. It wasn't easy. There were days when the grief was so overwhelming that she couldn't get out of bed, couldn't breathe. But then she would think of Alex, of his smile, of the way he had loved her so fiercely, and she would find the strength to keep going. Slowly, she began to heal. She started to play his guitar, the same one he had taught her to play. The music was her way of keeping him close, of remembering him, even as she learned to live without him. Years later, Sophie stood once again at the pier where it had all begun. The wind was gentle, the sky painted in soft pinks and oranges as the sun dipped below the horizon. She could almost feel Alex's presence beside her, hear the echo of his laughter in the wind. She smiled softly, her heart both heavy and light, knowing that he had been right. Life had gone on, and though she still missed him every day, she had found happiness again.